My name is Daniel Carter. I was 34 years old when I learned that every story my parents told about our family inheritance was a lie. For 22 years, my older brother Ethan received everything: the college fund, the lake house, Grandpa's antique truck, even the final inheritance check worth $486,000. I got handshakes, excuses, and the same sentence repeated so often I could hear it in my sleep. Grandpa wanted it that way. The last time I heard those words was on a rainy Thursday afternoon, standing in my parents' kitchen while the smell of burnt coffee filled the room. What they didn't know, what none of them knew, was that Grandpa had left behind one thing nobody had ever mentioned: a small black ledger hidden inside a locked wooden toolbox. I smiled, I nodded, then I drove home and made a phone call. Within 6 weeks, the inheritance was no longer the biggest secret in our family. The ledger was. If you've ever been told to stay quiet while someone rewrote your story, this one is for you, because sometimes the truth waits years for its turn. I grew up believing some children were simply worth more than others. Not because anyone said it directly, because they showed me every day. My older brother Ethan was 3 years older than me. He was the kind of kid adults noticed the second he walked into a room: tall, athletic, loud enough to fill every silence. I was different. I liked books. I liked fixing things. I liked sitting beside Grandpa in his workshop while he repaired old clocks that nobody else cared about. Ethan got attention. I got quiet corners. For most families, that difference would not matter. In ours, it mattered a lot. The first time I noticed it, I was 8. Ethan was 11. It happened on a Saturday morning. I still remember the smell of pancakes and maple syrup drifting through the house. Mom had made Ethan's favorite breakfast because he had scored 2 goals at a soccer game the night before. My report card sat beside my plate. Straight A's. Nobody mentioned it. Dad spent 20 minutes talking about Ethan's goals. Mom took pictures. They laughed. They celebrated. My report card remained untouched beside a glass of orange juice. I told myself it wasn't important. Children become experts at telling themselves things, especially when the truth hurts. By the time I turned 12, the pattern was impossible to miss. Ethan got a new bike. I got his old one. Ethan got summer sports camps. I got library cards. Ethan got praised for potential. I got thanked for being understanding. The words changed. The message never did. One evening, I asked Grandpa about it. We were sitting in his workshop. Rain tapped softly against the metal roof. The room smelled like sawdust and machine oil. A brass clock sat open on the table between us. "Why does Ethan always get more?" I asked. Grandpa kept working. Tiny gears clicked beneath his fingers. Then he looked at me. His blue eyes seemed older than usual. "Do you know what the strongest tree in a forest is?" he asked. I frowned. "No. The one that learns to grow in the shade." At 12 years old, I thought that was a strange answer. Years later, I understood. Or at least I thought I did. What I did not know yet was that Grandpa had been seeing things I couldn't. Not then. High school only widened the gap. Ethan became a local star. Football, basketball, student council. Every trophy earned a place in the living room. Every achievement became family news. When I won a state academic competition, Mom forgot to attend the ceremony. She said she had mixed up the dates. Maybe she had. Maybe she hadn't. Either way, the empty seat beside Grandpa hurt more than I expected. After the ceremony, Grandpa drove me home. The truck smelled like old leather and peppermint gum. He handed me a folded $20 bill. "Celebration money," he said. I laughed. "You don't have to do that." "I know." The bill stayed in my wallet for years. Not because of the money. Because somebody had noticed. Somebody had shown up. That mattered. Ethan left for college when he was 18. My parents cried for 3 days. Mom made photo albums. Dad gave speeches. You would have thought a president was moving away. 2 years later, I left for college too. Mom hugged me. Dad shook my hand. Then they asked if I could drive myself. Their car was unavailable. Ethan had borrowed it. I remember loading my bags into a second-hand sedan with 184,000 miles on it. The driver's door squeaked every time it opened. The air conditioner barely worked. Grandpa stood at the curb watching. The August heat shimmered above the pavement. Before I left, he handed me a small brass key. No label, I asked. No. What does it open? You'll know if you ever need it. I laughed. Grandpa didn't. That should have told me something. Instead, I put the key in my glove compartment and forgot about it. For years, college changed my life. Not because it was easy. Because it wasn't. I worked 30 hours a week. Delivered food. Stocked shelves. Cleaned offices at night. There were weeks when I survived on instant noodles and coffee. Meanwhile, Ethan's tuition was fully covered by my parents. Mine wasn't. Their explanation was simple. We helped him first. They promised they would help me later. Later never arrived. I graduated with debt. Ethan graduated with a celebration cruise. The difference became a family joke. A joke that was only funny to everyone except me. Still, I never hated Ethan. That surprises people. But the truth is more complicated. Ethan wasn't cruel. Not most of the time. He was simply raised to believe the spotlight belonged to him. When people are handed something long enough, they stop noticing they're holding it. The real problem wasn't Ethan. The real problem was everyone who kept handing things over. Years passed. I built a career in commercial property management. Nothing glamorous. Just steady work. Steady pay. Steady progress. I bought a modest house. Paid my bills. Lived quietly. Grandpa seemed proud of that. Every Sunday, he called. Always at exactly 6 in the evening. Never 6:01. Never 5:59. 6 sharp. We talked about work. Weather. Baseball. Whatever old project he was fixing. Sometimes we sat in silence. Neither of us minded. Then one Sunday, he said something strange. Something that stayed with me. People think the truth disappears if they hide it long enough. I laughed. Sounds mysterious. I'm serious. His voice was calm. Too calm. The truth doesn't disappear, Danny. Danny. He only used that nickname when something mattered. It waits. I remember looking out my kitchen window. The sun was setting. Orange light stretched across the backyard. What truth? I asked. There was a pause. A long one. For a moment, I thought the call had dropped. Then Grandpa sighed. Never mind. Grandpa. Not tonight. His voice sounded tired. Older than I had ever heard it. We talked about baseball instead. But something had changed. I could feel it. Like hearing a floorboard creak in an empty house. You know it means something. You just don't know what. 3 weeks later, Grandpa stopped answering his phone. And before the month was over, our entire family was standing in a hospital hallway, waiting for news that none of us wanted to hear. What I did not know yet was that Grandpa had already set something in motion. Something hidden. Something that would force every lie into the light. But first, he had to leave us behind. And that was only the beginning. The hospital smelled like disinfectant and stale coffee. I hated it the moment I walked in. The fluorescent lights washed every face pale. Shoes squeaked against the polished floor. Somewhere down the hallway, a machine beeped in a steady rhythm that felt far too calm for what was happening. Grandpa had suffered a stroke. That was the message I received at 5:42 a.m. on a Tuesday. By noon, the entire family was there. Mom sat beside the window, twisting a tissue in her hands. Dad paced. Ethan stood near the nurse's station, talking quietly into his phone. Nobody knew what to do. So we waited. Families do a lot of waiting when someone they love is dying. Waiting becomes its own kind of pain. Around 3 in the afternoon, the doctor finally appeared. I knew the answer before he spoke. His eyes gave it away. The room became very quiet. Even the air felt different. Grandpa was alive. But barely. The stroke had caused severe damage. The doctor explained percentages and probabilities. I remember none of them. What I remember is the sound Mom made. A small broken sound. Like something tearing. The next 4 days blurred together. Hospital chairs. Vending machine coffee. Sleepless nights. Endless hope fighting impossible odds. Grandpa never woke up. Not completely. There were moments when his eyes opened. Moments when his fingers moved. Moments when we convinced ourselves he was coming back. But he never truly returned. On Friday evening, I sat alone beside his bed. The sun was setting beyond the window. Orange light filled the room. His hands looked smaller than I remembered. Older. Fragile. For years, those hands had rebuilt engines, repaired clocks, and built half the furniture in his house. Now they barely moved. I swallowed hard. Thanks, I said. The word sounded stupid the second it left my mouth. Thanks. For what? For everything. For showing up. For noticing. For being the one person who always made room for me. I stared at the blanket. My throat burned. Then I felt something. A slight pressure. Grandpa's fingers. His hand squeezed mine. Weak. Brief. But real. I looked up. His eyes were open. Just barely. For 1 second, they focused on me. Then his lips moved. I leaned closer. What? His voice was little more than air. Key. I froze. The key. His eyes flickered. A tiny nod. Then another word. So faint I almost missed it. Wait. I leaned closer again. But his eyes had already closed. The moment was gone. The next morning, Grandpa passed away. He was 81 years old. The funeral took place 6 days later. More than 200 people attended. That did not surprise me. Grandpa had spent his entire life helping people. Neighbors. Friends. Strangers. Half the town seemed to have a story about him. The church smelled like polished wood and fresh flowers. Rain tapped softly against the stained glass windows. I sat beside Mom in the second row. Ethan sat on her other side. The service lasted nearly 2 hours. People laughed. People cried. People shared stories. Again and again, I heard the same theme. Generosity. Kindness. Integrity. Grandpa had been the sort of man people trusted. The sort of man whose word mattered. The sort of man who kept promises. That thought stayed with me. Especially later. After everyone else left. After the flowers. After the condolences. After the final handshake. Because 2 weeks later, we gathered again. This time at a lawyer's office. And that was where everything started. The conference room felt too cold. The air conditioner hummed overhead. A tray of untouched pastries sat in the corner. Nobody looked hungry. The attorney, Mr. Holloway, was a careful man in his 60s. Gray hair. Neat suit. Measured voice. He began reading Grandpa's will. At first, nothing seemed unusual. Several charitable donations, money set aside for community projects, specific gifts for friends, family heirlooms. Then came the inheritance section. I noticed Ethan sit up straighter. Dad crossed his arms. Mom stared at the table. The room suddenly felt much smaller. Mr. Holloway adjusted his glasses. Then he started reading numbers. Large numbers. Very large numbers. The lake house. Investment accounts. Land outside town. Savings. Stocks. Everything listed with precise detail. Grandpa had done well for himself. Much better than most people realized. Then came the distributions. And the room changed. The majority of the estate went to Ethan. Not all of it, but most. A lot most. The lake house. Several investment accounts. A substantial cash inheritance. Altogether worth nearly $500,000. I remember staring at the table, trying to understand what I had heard. Maybe I misunderstood. Maybe there was more. Then Mr. Holloway continued. My portion was significantly smaller. A modest cash amount. Some personal items. A few keepsakes. That was all. For several seconds, nobody spoke. I could hear the hum of the air conditioner, the ticking of a wall clock, the distant sound of traffic outside. Finally, Ethan cleared his throat. I wasn't expecting that. His surprise seemed genuine. Mom looked relieved. Dad looked relieved too. I noticed both reactions. At the time, I did not know why. Not yet. Mr. Holloway finished reading. Questions followed. Technical details. Tax information. Property transfers. I heard almost none of it. One sentence kept repeating inside my head. Grandpa wanted it that way. It made no sense. Not because I expected more money. I didn't. That wasn't it. Something simply felt wrong. Like a puzzle piece forced into the wrong place. The feeling stayed with me all afternoon. And all night. And all week. Every memory I had of Grandpa argued against what I had heard. Not because he loved me more. Because he was fair. Painfully fair. If two kids shared one cookie, Grandpa would bring out a ruler. That was who he was. Fairness mattered to him. Always. So why had he done this? The question followed me everywhere. 3 days later, Mom called. I know you're disappointed. I'm fine. You understand, right? The question caught me off guard. Understand what? That your grandfather made his choices. There was something strange in her voice. Not guilt. Not exactly. Something else. Something careful. Something rehearsed. I stared out the window. Rain slid down the glass. Did he ever explain them? I asked. Silence. A little too much silence. Then she answered. No. The reply came quickly. Too quickly. As though it had been prepared in advance. That should have bothered me more than it did. Instead, I let it go. At least for the moment. Because grief has a way of exhausting your instincts. You stop asking questions. You just try to survive the day. Weeks passed. Life resumed. Work. Bills. Meetings. Normal routines. On the surface, nothing changed. On the inside, something would not settle. I kept thinking about Grandpa's final words. The key. Wait. Just 2 words. Nothing more. Yet they refused to leave me alone. Then another detail started bothering me. A small one. Tiny really. The kind of thing most people would forget. At the lawyer's office, Mr. Holloway had mentioned that Grandpa updated his will 3 years before his death. 3 years. I remembered that clearly. Because 3 years earlier, Grandpa had called me after a family barbecue. He sounded angry. Not sad. Not confused. Angry. At the time, he refused to explain why. Now the memory returned. And it would not leave. The answer had been sitting somewhere in Grandpa's life all along. Hidden. Waiting. I just hadn't found it yet. Nothing happened for 2 weeks. Then something did. A phone call arrived on a Thursday morning. And by the end of that day, I would be standing inside Grandpa's workshop for the first time since his funeral. The same workshop where an old brass key waited in my glove compartment. The same workshop where a secret had been hidden for years. I just didn't know it yet. The phone call came at 9:17 on a Thursday morning. I was halfway through reviewing a property report when my cell phone buzzed. The screen showed an unfamiliar number. Normally, I would have ignored it. Something made me answer. Hello. Daniel. The voice belonged to Mr. Holloway, Grandpa's attorney. I sat up straighter. Is everything okay? There was a brief pause. That depends. I frowned. What does that mean? I found something in my records that may belong to you. My stomach tightened. What kind of something? Another pause. Long enough to make me notice it. I'd rather discuss it in person. The call ended 3 minutes later. By noon, I was driving across town. Gray clouds hung low over the streets. A cold wind pushed leaves across the pavement. The entire drive, I kept hearing Grandpa's last word. Wait. For weeks, I had done exactly that. Now I was no longer sure why. Mr. Holloway's office looked the same as before. Same brick building. Same polished lobby. Same receptionist. But this time, the atmosphere felt different. More serious. More careful. Mr. Holloway greeted me personally. His expression told me this was not a routine meeting. Not even close. He led me into a private office. Then he closed the door. That was when I knew something had changed. What did you find? I asked. He opened a folder. Inside sat a single document. Nothing dramatic. Just one piece of paper. Yet he handled it like evidence. This arrived 3 years ago. My pulse quickened. From who? Your grandfather. That answer surprised me. Mr. Holloway slid the document across the desk. I picked it up. At first glance, it looked insignificant. A handwritten note. Short. Simple. Dated 3 years before Grandpa's death. I recognized the handwriting immediately. The sharp letters. The careful spacing. The slight slant. Grandpa. Without question. The note contained only one sentence. If circumstances remain unresolved, Daniel should receive the workshop contents personally. That was it. Nothing more. I read it twice. Then 3 times. What does this mean? Mr. Holloway folded his hands. I don't know. You've never seen anything like this. I've seen many unusual things. His voice remained calm. But your grandfather specifically instructed me not to mention this unless certain conditions existed. I stared at him. What conditions? He believed something would eventually come to light. The room seemed colder. What exactly? He never said. I looked down at the note again. A strange feeling settled into my chest. Not excitement. Not hope. Something else. The feeling that I had just stepped onto the first stone of a much longer path. What happens now? I asked. Mr. Holloway leaned back. The workshop contents legally belong to you. That caught me completely off guard. The workshop. Everything inside. I blinked. Everything. He nodded. Tools, equipment, storage cabinets, personal property, anything located within the workshop itself. For several seconds, I said nothing. The workshop had never been mentioned during the will reading. Not once. At the time, I assumed it would be sold with the rest of Grandpa's property. Apparently not. Apparently, Grandpa had separated it. Specifically. Deliberately. And for some reason, he wanted me to have it. The question was why. What I did not know yet was that the answer had been sitting inside that building for years. Waiting. The drive to Grandpa's property felt surreal. The road wound through familiar farmland. Fields stretched toward the horizon. The same fields Grandpa had driven through thousands of times. The same roads where he had taught me how to drive. Every mile carried memories. By the time I reached the property, my chest felt tight. The house stood empty. Quiet. Still. A place without its owner. That always feels wrong. I parked beside the workshop. For a long moment, I stayed inside the car. The building looked exactly the same. Red paint. Metal roof. Weathered wooden doors. Nothing had changed. Yet somehow everything had. Finally, I stepped out. The wind carried the smell of rain. My shoes crunched across gravel. The workshop door opened with the same familiar groan. Inside, dust floated through shafts of sunlight. The air smelled like sawdust and machine oil. For one brief second, I expected Grandpa to look up from his workbench. To smile. To say something sarcastic. Instead, there was only silence. I swallowed hard. Then I walked inside. The place was frozen in time. Tools hung neatly on pegboards. Shelves remained perfectly organized. Projects sat exactly where Grandpa had left them. Every wrench. Every hammer. Every screw. Everything had a place. I spent the next 2 hours sorting through boxes. Mostly memories. Old manuals. Photographs. Receipts. Nothing unusual. Nothing secret. Nothing that explained the strange note. Part of me felt foolish. Maybe there was no mystery. Maybe grief was making me search for answers that did not exist. Then I noticed something. A toolbox. Not unusual by itself. Grandpa owned dozens. But this one sat alone on a shelf near the back wall. Dust covered everything around it. Not the toolbox. The metal surface looked cleaner. Recently handled. Or at least handled more recently than everything else. I climbed onto a stool. Pulled it down. Set it on the workbench. It felt heavier than expected. Very heavy. I opened the lid. Empty. At least mostly. A few old screws. Nothing important. I almost put it back. Then I heard it. A dull sound. Something shifting inside the metal base. I froze. The sound came again. Not loud. But unmistakable. Something was hidden inside. My pulse quickened. I turned the toolbox over. Examined the bottom. Nothing obvious. No latch. No compartment. No markings. Still, the weight bothered me. And the sound bothered me more. I spent 10 minutes searching. Nothing. Finally, frustrated, I sat down. That was when I noticed something else. A tiny scratch near one corner. Not random. Intentional. My finger traced the mark. The metal moved. Barely. A hidden panel slid open. I stared. For several seconds, I simply stared. Then I reached inside. My hand touched leather. Old leather. Worn leather. Carefully, I pulled the object free. A small black ledger. No title. No label. No markings. Just a plain black book. My heartbeat became painfully loud. The room suddenly felt smaller. I opened the cover. The first page contained only one sentence, written in Grandpa's handwriting. The truth has a cost. Read everything before you decide what to do. I stared at the words. A chill ran down my arms. Outside, thunder rumbled in the distance. The sound seemed impossibly far away. Slowly, I turned the next page. Numbers, dates, names, pages and pages of entries, some dating back more than 20 years. I did not understand what I was looking at. Not yet. But one thing became clear immediately. This was not a diary. This was a record. A very detailed record. And on the third page, I saw the first familiar name. My father's. That was the moment the official story began to crack. Not break. Not yet. Just crack. But once cracks appear, they tend to spread. The reason they came back to that inheritance meeting had nothing to do with honoring Grandpa's wishes. I didn't know that yet. But the ledger did. And before long, so would I. What I could not answer was the question now staring back at me from those pages. Why had Grandpa spent 22 years documenting everything? And what exactly had he been preparing me to find? I did not take the ledger home immediately. For almost 10 minutes, I sat alone at Grandpa's workbench staring at it. The black leather cover looked ordinary. Too ordinary. That bothered me. After all the secrecy, after the hidden compartment, after Grandpa's final words, I expected something dramatic. Instead, it looked like an old accounting book. Outside, rain began tapping against the workshop roof. The sound echoed softly through the building. I opened the ledger again. The first pages contained dates. Thousands of dates. Neatly organized. Painfully detailed. Every entry used the same format. Date. Amount. Name. Short note. Nothing more. At first it seemed meaningless. Then I noticed a pattern. The names repeated. Again. And again. And again. My father's name appeared dozens of times. Then hundreds. My mother's too. Sometimes Ethan's. Sometimes people I barely recognized. Neighbors. Accountants. Bank managers. Business associates. The farther I read, the stranger it became. One entry stopped me cold. March 14, 2004, $12,000 transferred. Explanation given to Daniel differs from reality. I read it twice. Then a third time. My stomach tightened. Daniel. Me. The date felt familiar. I tried to remember why. Then it hit me. March 2004. The bike. The year Ethan got a brand new mountain bike, while I inherited his old one. I remembered asking Dad why money was tight. His answer had been immediate. We can't afford extras right now. The memory returned with perfect clarity. Dad standing in the garage. The smell of motor oil. The sound of rain outside. His hand on my shoulder. We can't afford extras. Yet according to the ledger, $12,000 had moved somewhere that same week. I stared at the page. Maybe it was unrelated. Maybe. But doubt had entered the room. And doubt is difficult to remove once it arrives. I kept reading. The next few entries seemed harmless. Property taxes. Investments. Loan repayments. Nothing unusual. Then another note appeared. August 8, 2008, conversation documented. Story adjusted. Daniel not informed. My pulse quickened. Story adjusted. What story? I flipped backward. Then forward. The phrase appeared again. And again. And again. Not identical. Similar. Documented. Adjusted. Not informed. Several pages contained versions of those same words. always attached to financial decisions, always involving family matters, always connected somehow to me. The pattern was impossible to ignore. I felt a growing pressure in my chest. Not anger. Not yet. Confusion. Because none of it made sense. If Grandpa believed something dishonest was happening, why not simply confront everyone? Why spend years writing notes? Why create a secret ledger? The answer wasn't there. At least not yet. I turned another page and found the first envelope. It had been taped inside the ledger. Yellow with age. My name written across the front. Just my first name. Daniel. My hands suddenly felt unsteady. I carefully opened it. Inside sat a folded document. A photocopy. Bank records. Several transfers highlighted in yellow. The account names meant nothing to me. The dates did. One transfer totaled $28,500. Another $17,000. Another $34,000. All occurring during years when I repeatedly heard the same phrase from my parents. Money is tight. I leaned back in my chair. The workshop suddenly felt smaller. The rain sounded louder. Something was wrong. Very wrong. What I did not know yet was that I was still looking at the wrong suspect. The ledger wanted me to think one thing. The truth was something else entirely. I drove home before dark. The ledger sat on the passenger seat. Every red light felt longer than normal. Every mile raised new questions. By the time I reached my house, my head hurt. I barely slept that night. The ledger stayed on my kitchen table. I kept walking past it, looking at it, avoiding it, then returning again. At 2:11 a.m., I gave up, made coffee, opened the book, and kept reading. That was when I found Ethan. Not just his name. Pages dedicated to him. An entire section. The entries stretched for years. College payments, vehicle purchases, investment contributions, mortgage assistance, amounts that made my eyes widen. Some reached 6 figures. Others were smaller. Together, they represented an enormous amount of money. Far more than I had imagined. A cold feeling settled over me. Maybe this was the answer. Maybe Ethan had known all along. Maybe he had quietly benefited while pretending otherwise. The possibility hurt more than I expected. Not because of the money. Because Ethan was still my brother. Despite everything. I remembered teaching him how to replace a flat tire. Helping him move apartments. Watching football games together. Normal moments. Real moments. If he had known, those memories would change. I wasn't sure I wanted them to. Then I found another note. Handwritten. Underlined twice. Ethan unaware, do not blame him. I stared at the words. The room became very quiet. Do not blame him. Grandpa had written that deliberately. Clearly. Directly. Almost as if he knew exactly where my thoughts would go. That changed everything. Or at least it should have. Instead, it created a bigger question. If Ethan wasn't responsible, who was? I checked the clock. 3:46 a.m. My coffee had gone cold. The house felt empty. Outside, wind rattled the trees. I turned another page. And another. Then another. The deeper I went, the less this looked like a financial record. And the more it resembled evidence. Every claim included documents. Receipts. Statements. Copies. Notes. Dates. Cross-references. Nothing emotional. Nothing dramatic. Just facts. Page after page. The precision felt deliberate. Like Grandpa knew accusations alone would never be enough. Facts would matter, Proof would matter. That realization bothered me more than anything else. Because people do not spend 22 years collecting proof unless they expect resistance. Around dawn, I found something new. A list. Only 6 names. My father. My mother. An accountant. A banker. A financial advisor. And one name I didn't recognize. Beside each sat a series of dates. Meetings. Phone calls. Discussions. No explanations. Just records. The mystery deepened. Not solved. Deepened. Which meant I still lacked the most important piece. Motive. Why? Why would anyone spend decades manipulating family finances? Why keep secrets this long? Why risk everything? The answer arrived later that afternoon. Completely by accident. I was reviewing another envelope when a folded photograph slipped from between 2 pages. It landed face down on the table. I picked it up, turned it over, and froze. The picture showed Grandpa standing beside a bank manager, both smiling. Behind them hung a calendar. The year was visible. Written across the back in Grandpa's handwriting were 6 words. This is where it started. My heart pounded. Not because the photo explained anything. Because it didn't. It created a doorway. A beginning. A starting point. For the first time, I realized the ledger wasn't documenting random events. It was documenting a single story. One that began 22 years earlier. One that connected everything. The inheritance. The transfers. The lies. The missing explanations. All of it. And somewhere inside those pages was the reason Grandpa spent the final years of his life preparing for this moment. I looked at the clock. Almost 4 in the afternoon. For one brief moment, I considered calling my parents. Demanding answers. Demanding explanations. Instead, I closed the ledger. Took a deep breath. And waited. Because I still didn't know enough. Not even close. What I needed next wasn't confrontation. It was understanding. And hidden between the next section of pages was a discovery that would point suspicion directly at Ethan. For 1 week, I would believe I had solved the entire mystery. I would be wrong. Very wrong. But I didn't know that yet. For the next week, I barely thought about anything except the ledger. Work became background noise. Meetings blurred together. Emails piled up. Every evening, I came home, sat at my kitchen table, and opened Grandpa's black book. The ledger had become an obsession. Not because of the money. Because of the questions. Every answer seemed to create 3 more. And now one possibility kept pulling at me. Ethan. I knew what Grandpa had written. Ethan unaware, do not blame him. But the numbers told a different story. Or so I thought. Thousands of dollars. Then tens of thousands. Then hundreds of thousands. Cars. Tuition. Investments. Property assistance. Benefits that somehow always seemed to flow in one direction. Toward him. Away from me. The pattern felt impossible to ignore. By the 5th night, I started building a timeline. Documents spread across my dining room table. Highlighted dates. Printed notes. Stacks of paper. The room smelled like coffee and printer ink. Outside, rain tapped softly against the windows. I worked until nearly midnight. And eventually, something emerged. A sequence. Not proof. Not yet. But enough to suggest a theory. Every major financial advantage Ethan received seemed connected to a family decision that affected me. When he received college funding, mine disappeared. When he received help with a house, my promised assistance never arrived. When he received investment opportunities, nobody mentioned them to me. Again and again, the pattern repeated. The conclusion felt obvious. Too obvious. That should have been my warning. Instead, I convinced myself I was seeing the truth. The next morning, I called Ethan. He answered on the third ring. Hey. His voice sounded normal. Relaxed. Unaware. I hesitated. For a moment, I almost hung up. Instead, I asked a simple question. Did Grandpa ever talk to you about money? Silence. Then a laugh. What kind of question is that? A serious one. The laughter faded. Not really. Never. No. I stared out my office window. Traffic crawled through the intersection below. Did Mom and Dad? About what? The inheritance. Another pause. Longer this time. Daniel, what's going on? I considered telling him everything. The ledger. The records. The questions. Instead, I said nothing. Because something felt wrong. Not suspicious. Wrong. Like I was looking at a puzzle from the wrong angle. I'll call you later. Before he could respond, I ended the call. His reaction stayed with me. Not because it seemed dishonest. Because it seemed confused. Genuinely confused. And confusion is difficult to fake. That evening, I returned to the ledger. I needed something definitive. Something clear. Something that would either confirm my suspicions or destroy them. For 3 hours, I found nothing. Then I reached a section marked with a paper clip. The pages inside were different. More detailed. More personal. Grandpa's handwriting appeared frequently. Entire paragraphs instead of short notes. The first entry was dated 11 years earlier. I began reading. Within minutes, my stomach tightened. The notes described arguments, family discussions, private conversations, conversations involving money, promises, disagreements, pressure. One entry stood out immediately. Ethan believes support came from savings. He does not know the source. I stopped reading. Then read it again. The wording mattered. Very carefully. He does not know the source. Not suspected. Not denied. Not lied. Did not know. The distinction felt important. A crack appeared in my theory. A small crack. But a crack nonetheless. I kept reading. The next entries widened it. Again and again, Grandpa repeated similar observations. Ethan unaware. Ethan not informed. Discussion occurred without Ethan present. The evidence became harder to ignore. If Grandpa was telling the truth, and every page suggested he was, then Ethan wasn't orchestrating anything. He was benefiting. Yes, but benefiting is not the same as causing. That realization changed the investigation completely. Because now the spotlight shifted elsewhere, toward the people making the decisions. Mom. Dad. The thought unsettled me. More than Ethan ever had. Children expect flaws from siblings. Parents are different. Parents are supposed to be the stable part of the equation. The foundation. The explanation. What happens when they're the mystery instead? I found myself staring at old memories differently. Conversations I had forgotten. Comments I once dismissed. Mom's rehearsed answers. Dad's quick explanations. Their strange relief during the inheritance meeting. Small details. Tiny details. Yet together, they formed something larger. Something uncomfortable. 3 days later, I visited the lake house. The property now belonged to Ethan. He had invited me over, probably sensing something was wrong. The afternoon was warm. Sunlight reflected off the water. The dock creaked gently beneath our feet. For a while, we talked about ordinary things. Work. Sports. Life. Neither of us mentioned the inheritance. Neither of us mentioned Grandpa. Eventually, Ethan broke the silence. You've been acting strange. I laughed softly. Maybe. Did I do something? The question caught me off guard. He looked genuinely concerned. Not defensive. Concerned. For a moment, I saw the kid who used to sneak snacks into my room after Mom grounded me. The brother who once drove 4 hours to help me move apartments. The brother who occasionally frustrated me, but never truly betrayed me. And suddenly I knew. I had been chasing the wrong person. The realization arrived quietly. Like a door opening. Not dramatic. Not explosive. Just clear. No, I said. You didn't. Ethan studied me. Then nodded. Neither of us spoke for several seconds. The lake water lapped gently against the dock. A boat drifted in the distance. The moment felt strangely peaceful. Almost hopeful. That should have worried me. Because this was the false resolution. The point where I thought I understood everything. The point where I believed the mystery was nearly solved. For 1 week, I carried that belief. For 1 week, I thought the answers were finally within reach. Then the call came. And everything collapsed. It happened on a Tuesday afternoon. I was reviewing lease agreements when my phone rang. The caller ID displayed a name I did not recognize. I answered. Hello. The woman on the other end sounded nervous. Daniel Carter. Yes. My name is Rebecca Lawson. The name meant nothing to me. At first. Then she added 6 words. I worked at First Regional Bank. My pulse quickened instantly. The photograph. The bank manager. The note. This is where it started. I sat upright. What can I do for you? Silence. Then a deep breath. The kind people take before changing their lives. I think your grandfather wanted you to find me. The room suddenly felt very quiet. Rebecca continued. I've been waiting a long time for this call. My heartbeat became painfully loud. Waiting for what? Another pause. Long enough to make me uneasy. Then she said the sentence that shattered everything I thought I knew. The inheritance isn't the real story. I gripped the phone tighter. What is? When she answered, every assumption I had built over the past week began to crumble. Because according to Rebecca, the money wasn't the secret. The money was only the evidence. The real secret was why it had moved in the first place. And that truth was far bigger than anything I had imagined. I did not sleep that night. Rebecca Lawson's words kept replaying in my head. The inheritance isn't the real story. If the money wasn't the story, then what was? For nearly a month, every question had pointed toward finances. Transfers. Accounts. Property. Inheritance. Numbers. Now Rebecca was telling me I had been looking at symptoms instead of causes. The realization unsettled me. Because if she was right, everything was about to get bigger. The next afternoon, we met at a small cafe 30 miles outside town. Her choice. Not mine. That detail mattered. People who carry secrets for years often choose their surroundings carefully. The cafe sat beside a highway. Nothing special. Just a quiet place where nobody paid attention to strangers. The smell of fresh coffee filled the room. Soft music played overhead. Rain tapped lightly against the windows. Rebecca arrived exactly on time. Mid-60s. Gray hair. Professional posture. The kind of person who spent decades handling confidential information. She looked nervous. Not guilty. Nervous. There is a difference. After brief introductions, she opened a folder. A familiar feeling settled into my stomach. Another folder. Another set of documents. Another layer. Type B secret stories always work that way. One door opens into another. And another. And another. Rebecca slid several papers across the table. I retired 6 years ago. I glanced down. Bank records. Old ones. Very old. Some dating back more than 2 decades. Your grandfather asked me to keep copies. That sentence instantly got my attention. He expected this. Rebecca nodded. Not exactly. She hesitated. He hoped it wouldn't become necessary. The answer felt very much like Grandpa. Always preparing. Always hopping preparation would never be needed. I looked at the documents. The first few pages showed transfers. Nothing surprising there. I had already seen similar records in the ledger. Then I noticed something different. The destination accounts. Not Ethan's. Not mine. Not my parents'. A separate account. One I didn't recognize. The same account appeared repeatedly. Year after year. Amount after amount. Thousands. Then tens of thousands. Then hundreds of thousands. The total made my chest tighten. Whose account is this? Rebecca remained silent. For several seconds. Too many seconds. Finally she answered. That's the question your grandfather spent 22 years documenting. The cafe suddenly felt smaller. I stared at the account number. What was so important about it? Rebecca folded her hands. Because that account explains everything. I waited. She looked down briefly. Then back at me. Your grandfather discovered something in 1999. The year from the photograph. My pulse quickened. What? Her eyes softened. Almost sadly. He discovered that money intended for someone else was being redirected. I blinked. What money? She held my gaze. Yours. The word landed like a punch. For several seconds, I genuinely thought I had misunderstood. Mine. Rebecca nodded. Yes. The room became very quiet. The rain outside seemed louder. What are you talking about? She took a deep breath. Then she told me a story I never expected to hear. In 1999, Grandpa had created a long-term financial structure for both grandchildren. Equal. Perfectly equal. Education funds. Investment funds. Future property assistance. Everything carefully balanced. Exactly what I would have expected from him. Exactly what fairness looked like. But somewhere after its creation, the balance changed. Gradually. Quietly. Without discussion. Without transparency. Without my knowledge. Or Ethan's. Money originally designated for both grandchildren increasingly flowed toward one side. Not all at once. Slowly. Small amounts first. Then larger amounts. Over years. Then decades. I felt sick. Not because of the money. Because of the intention. Someone had been making deliberate decisions. Repeatedly. Over 22 years. That requires planning. That requires choice. That requires motive. What did Grandpa do when he found out? Rebecca looked toward the window. He confronted them. Them. Not him. Them. That single word eliminated any remaining doubt. My parents. I already knew. Yet hearing it still hurt. What happened? Rebecca laughed softly. No humor in it. Only sadness. They denied everything. I looked down at the documents. That sounded familiar. Painfully familiar. The same people who always had explanations. Always had reasons. Always had stories. Apparently, this had not started recently. It had started decades ago. The second folder contained meeting notes. Copies, dates, witnesses, conversations, not emotional accusations. Facts, always facts. That was Grandpa's style. Every allegation supported, every claim documented, every statement verified. The deeper I read, the worse it became. By the end of the second hour, one reality had become impossible to ignore. This was not a misunderstanding, not a bookkeeping error, not favoritism, not even greed alone. This was a long-term system, built carefully, protected carefully, maintained carefully, for 22 years. And the most disturbing part, the money itself still wasn't the secret. Not entirely. Rebecca finally revealed that near the end of our meeting. She handed me a final envelope. Unlike the others, it contained only one page. A letter, written by Grandpa, addressed to her, dated 4 years before his death. My hands felt unsteady as I read. Most of the letter discussed evidence, documentation, protection, contingency plans. Then I reached the final paragraph and froze. The money matters less than the reason. If Daniel ever learns the reason, he will finally understand why I could never stop documenting it. I read the sentence again, then again. The reason, not the money. The reason. The same phrase Rebecca had used. The same phrase Grandpa emphasized. The same phrase I still did not understand. I lowered the page. What reason? Rebecca looked uncomfortable. For the first time since arriving. Genuinely uncomfortable. That scared me, because until now she had seemed composed, certain, prepared. Now she hesitated. That meant the next part mattered. A lot. I don't know everything. The answer surprised me. What? I know the financial side. She pointed at the folders. The records, the transfers, the meetings. She paused. But there was one conversation your grandfather never shared with anyone. A cold feeling crept down my spine. Who was involved? Rebecca met my eyes. Your parents. I already expected that. Then she added 4 more words. And your grandmother. I froze. My grandmother. The woman who died when I was 10. The woman nobody ever talked about. The woman whose photographs slowly disappeared from the house after her death. The woman connected to almost none of my memories. Suddenly, she was part of this story too. How? Why? Rebecca shook her head. I don't know the details. The frustration hit instantly. So where are they? She pointed toward the ledger. The answer is probably in there. I stared at her. She continued. Your grandfather started documenting finances after that conversation. The statement landed heavily. After that conversation. Meaning the financial manipulation had been a consequence, not the cause. For the first time, I could see the shape of the real mystery. And it terrified me. Because financial betrayal made sense. People do terrible things for money all the time. But this seemed connected to something older. Something emotional. Something buried. Something powerful enough to reshape an entire family. When we finally left the cafe, the rain had stopped. The sky was clearing. Sunlight broke through the clouds. Neither of us spoke much. There was nothing left to say. The documents were real. The evidence was overwhelming. The financial mystery was effectively solved. My parents had done it. The ledger proved it. The bank records proved it. The witnesses proved it. Yet somehow I felt farther from the truth than ever. Because now I understood the numbers. What I didn't understand was the motive. And according to Grandpa, motive was everything. Nothing happened for 6 days. Then something did. Late Sunday evening, while reviewing the final section of the ledger, I discovered a sealed envelope hidden inside the back cover. Unlike every other document, this one carried a handwritten warning. 3 words. Read last, promise. I stared at those words for a very long time. Then I carefully opened the envelope. And inside was the explanation Grandpa had spent 22 years preparing me to find. The envelope felt heavier than paper should. Maybe because of what it represented. Maybe because I already knew my life was about to divide into 2 parts. Before I read it, and after, the house was silent. The clock above my stove read 9:43 p.m. A half-finished cup of coffee sat beside the ledger. Cold. Forgotten. Outside, wind rattled the trees. For several minutes, I simply stared at the envelope. Grandpa's handwriting covered the front. Only 3 words. Read last, promise. I had kept that promise. Now there was nowhere left to go except forward. I carefully unfolded the pages. There were 8 of them. Typed. Single-spaced. Signed by Grandpa. The first sentence changed everything. Daniel, if you are reading this, I failed to stop them. I felt my chest tighten. Not because of the words themselves. Because Grandpa never talked that way. Never. He fixed things. Solved things. Protected people. The idea that he considered himself a failure felt wrong. Painfully wrong. I kept reading. And within minutes, the entire story began rearranging itself. The money had never been the beginning. Rebecca was right. The money was the aftermath. The real story started with my grandmother. 22 years earlier. Just before her death. According to Grandpa, she had left behind a written request. Nothing legal. Nothing binding. A simple family letter. Her final wish. She wanted both grandsons treated equally. Not just financially. Emotionally. Practically. In every meaningful way. She specifically wrote that neither child should carry the burden of family favoritism. She had witnessed it growing up. She hated it. She wanted something better for us. I swallowed hard. Because I already knew how that story ended. Not well. The next pages explained why. Several months after her death, a conversation took place. A private conversation. One that included Grandpa, Mom, and Dad. And during that conversation, something surfaced. A belief. A preference. A decision. One that would quietly shape the next 2 decades. My parents believed Ethan needed more. Not temporarily. Not during a difficult year. Always. More support. More resources. More opportunities. More protection. More investment. Their reasoning appeared repeatedly throughout Grandpa's notes. Ethan was outgoing. Confident. Charismatic. A future leader. Someone destined for bigger things. I was described differently. Independent. Responsible. Self-sufficient. Able to manage without help. The words made me laugh. A bitter laugh. Because I had heard versions of them my entire life. Every time support disappeared. Every time promises changed. Every time resources flowed elsewhere. The explanation remained the same. Daniel will be fine. The phrase appeared again and again throughout Grandpa's records. Like a family slogan. Like a justification. Like permission. Daniel will be fine. I stared at those words. For 22 years, that sentence had cost me opportunities. And nobody had ever considered asking whether I wanted to be fine. The next section hurt more. Much more. Because Grandpa documented his attempts to stop it. The first confrontation happened in 2000. Then 2002. Then 2004. Then again and again. Years of arguments. Years of warnings. Years of promises. My parents always said the same thing. They would correct things later. Balance things later. Make things right later. Later became 22 years. Later never arrived. I turned another page. Then another. My pulse quickened. The documents were becoming more personal. More painful. Grandpa included memories. Specific events. Specific decisions. Specific moments. Moments I remembered. Moments I thought were random. Moments that suddenly made terrible sense. The academic competition. The missing college support. The abandoned investment account. The canceled opportunities. One by one, Grandpa explained each decision. Not emotionally. Factually. Painfully factually. The evidence felt overwhelming. And yet one question still remained. Why? Why maintain the deception? Why not simply admit it? Why spend decades hiding something everyone could already feel? The answer appeared near the bottom of page 6. And it made me physically sit back in my chair. Because it was smaller than I expected. Smaller. And somehow uglier. Pride. That was it. Pride. According to Grandpa, the imbalance grew so gradually that admitting it became increasingly difficult. Every year required explaining the previous year. Every choice required defending earlier choices. The longer it continued, the harder it became to reverse. Eventually, the lie became easier than the truth. Then the lie became the family story. Then the family story became reality. At least for everyone telling it. I closed my eyes. The explanation felt horrifyingly human. Not evil. Not dramatic. Just years of bad decisions protected by ego. The kind of thing people do every day. The kind of thing that destroys families anyway. I kept reading. The final pages described Grandpa's decision to create the ledger. Not out of revenge. Not out of anger. Out of fear. Fear that after his death, the official story would become permanent. Fear that nobody would challenge it. Fear that history would be rewritten. So he documented everything. Every transfer. Every promise. Every contradiction. Every explanation. 22 years of records. Not to punish anyone. To preserve reality. By the time I reached the final page, tears blurred my vision. I wasn't crying because of money. I wasn't crying because of inheritance. I was crying because someone had spent 2 decades fighting for me without telling me. Someone had noticed. Every single time. Every disappointment. Every broken promise. Every quiet injustice. Grandpa had seen it all. And he had refused to look away. The final paragraph nearly broke me. You were never less valuable, Daniel. They simply convinced themselves you needed less. Those are not the same thing. Never confuse them. I read the sentence 3 times. Then 4. Then 5. The house felt impossibly quiet. For several minutes, I couldn't move. Couldn't think. Couldn't do anything except stare. Eventually, I looked toward the ledger. The black cover reflected the kitchen light. 22 years. 22 years of documentation. 22 years of patience. 22 years of preparation. All leading here. To this moment. To this truth. I thought that was the end. It wasn't. Not even close. Because the following morning, outside consequences finally arrived. And once they started moving, nobody could stop them. Not me. Not Ethan. Not my parents. Not anyone. At 8:12 a.m., my phone rang. The caller ID showed Mr. Holloway. When I answered, his voice sounded unusually serious. Daniel, what's wrong? There was a pause. Then he said something I never expected to hear. "The accountant wants to talk." I frowned. "What accountant?" "The one named in your grandfather's records." My heartbeat quickened. "Why now?" Mr. Holloway exhaled slowly. "Because sometimes the truth creates movement all by itself." And apparently, word had begun spreading. "The accountant heard you've opened the ledger." I froze. The silence stretched. Then Mr. Holloway added one final sentence. A sentence that changed the direction of everything. "He's bringing documents nobody knew existed." What happened next was not what I expected. And it was definitely not what my parents expected either. What happened next was not what I expected. And it was not what my parents expected either. By Wednesday afternoon, I was sitting inside Mr. Holloway's conference room again. The same room where Grandpa's will had been read. The same room where I first heard that Ethan would inherit most of the estate. The same room where my parents had looked relieved. Now it felt completely different. The air seemed heavier, more serious, like a storm waiting to break. 5 people were already there when I arrived. Mr. Holloway, Rebecca Lawson, the retired banker, a certified accountant named Martin Reeves, and Ethan. That surprised me. Apparently, Mr. Holloway had invited him. Probably because what came next affected both of us. Ethan stood when I entered. His expression looked uneasy. "What's going on?" I shook my head. "I don't know yet." That was true. At least partly. The ledger sat on the conference table. Black leather. Worn edges. Quiet. Yet somehow it controlled the room. 20 minutes later, my parents arrived. Mom looked confused. Dad looked annoyed. The moment they saw Rebecca and Martin, both expressions changed. Not dramatically. Just enough. Just enough for me to notice. Dad's shoulders stiffened. Mom stopped smiling. Tiny reactions. Powerful reactions. Mr. Holloway noticed them too. I could tell. Nobody said anything. Not yet. The room fell silent. Then Martin Reeves opened a briefcase. The metal clasps clicked loudly. Every head turned. Inside sat several thick folders. Years of records. Years of documentation. Years of consequences. Martin removed the first folder. Placed it carefully on the table. Then he spoke. "I retired 8 years ago." His voice remained calm. Professional. Measured. Before retirement, I handled portions of the Carter family financial records. Nobody interrupted. Nobody moved. Martin opened the folder. And everything began. The next 90 minutes felt surreal. Document after document appeared. Bank records. Investment records. Signed correspondence. Financial instructions. Meeting notes. Independent reviews. Third-party confirmations. Not opinions. Facts. Always facts. The same pattern Grandpa had followed. The same pattern that made denial increasingly impossible. Every major claim inside the ledger gained support. Every transfer gained verification. Every contradiction gained proof. The deeper Martin went, the quieter the room became. Especially my parents. At first they attempted explanations. Misunderstandings. Accounting decisions. Family priorities. Temporary circumstances. The usual language. The familiar language. The language I had heard for decades. But facts have a way of exhausting excuses. Especially when there are hundreds of them. Eventually, even Dad stopped talking. Then came the moment nobody expected. Not me. Not Ethan. Not anyone. Martin opened the final folder. The room became very still. Even he seemed uncomfortable. That got my attention immediately, because until now he had appeared completely composed. He removed a sealed envelope, yellow with age. The paper looked old, very old. Martin glanced toward Mr. Holloway, then toward Rebecca. Both nodded. Carefully, he opened it. Inside sat a single letter. I recognized the handwriting immediately. My grandmother's. The room blurred for a moment. I had not seen her handwriting in decades. Neither had anyone else. Martin cleared his throat, then began reading. The letter was not legal, not formal, just personal. A grandmother writing about her family, her hopes, her fears, her wishes. She spoke about Ethan. She spoke about me. She spoke about fairness, love, balance, responsibility. Everything Grandpa had described. Then Martin reached the final paragraph. The paragraph nobody in the room was prepared for, especially my parents. My grandmother wrote that she worried favoritism was already beginning. Small signs, small decisions, small differences. Nothing dramatic, yet enough to concern her. She specifically asked that both boys always be given equal opportunities whenever possible. Not because they were identical, because they were equally valuable. The room fell completely silent. I looked toward Mom. Her eyes filled with tears. Dad stared at the table. Neither spoke. Neither could. Because now the truth came from someone no longer present to argue with. Someone impossible to dismiss. Someone who had seen the beginning. The silence stretched. Then Ethan stood up. Nobody expected that. Least of all me. He looked pale, genuinely shaken. For several seconds, he struggled to find words. When he finally spoke, his voice cracked. You knew. The question was directed at our parents. Nobody answered. Ethan repeated it. Louder. You knew. Mom began crying. Dad looked away. And in that moment, I saw something I never expected to see. Not guilt. Not exactly. Defeat. 22 years of explanations had finally run out. The story had reached its ending. For one long minute, nobody spoke. Then Dad exhaled heavily. The sound seemed to age him. Years. Maybe decades. He rubbed his face, stared at the table, and finally said the words he should have spoken a long time ago. Yes. The room remained silent. No dramatic shouting. No explosions. Just silence. Sometimes silence hurts more. Dad looked toward me. Then Ethan. Then back at the table. We thought we were helping. The sentence sounded weak even as he said it. Because everyone in the room understood something important. Intentions explain behavior. They do not erase consequences. 22 years remain 22 years. No explanation could change that. Mom eventually spoke too. Through tears. Brokenly. She described fear. Mistakes. Rationalizations. Promises to fix things later. The same story Grandpa documented. Again and again. Always later. Never now. Listening to her felt strange. Part of me felt angry. Part of me felt sad. Most of me simply felt tired. Because the fight had already happened. Grandpa fought it. For decades. The evidence fought it. The documents fought it. Nothing I said would add much. The truth had arrived on its own. Exactly as Grandpa intended. And because it arrived from outside sources, nobody could claim I created it. Nobody could call it revenge. Nobody could call it exaggeration. Reality stood on its own. That mattered. More than I realized. The meeting ended shortly afterward. Not because everything was resolved, because there was nothing left to prove. The truth was now public, known, documented, permanent. As people began leaving, Ethan stopped beside me. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then he surprised me. I didn't know. I know. His eyes reddened. I should have. I shook my head. No. Because Grandpa had been right. Ethan benefited. But he was never the architect. That distinction mattered. A lot. Outside, the afternoon sun broke through the clouds. The parking lot shimmered from recent rain. For the first time in weeks, I felt something unexpected. Not victory. Peace. Small. Fragile. Incomplete. But real. The truth was finally out. Yet one final chapter remained. Because exposure and healing are not the same thing. And before this story ended, I still needed to discover what Grandpa had actually wanted all along. The answer waited inside one final item from the workshop. The same symbolic object that started everything. The black ledger. And what I found inside it would change the ending completely. 3 days after the meeting, I returned to Grandpa's workshop. Alone. The road felt familiar now. Fields stretched beneath a bright summer sky. The air smelled like freshly cut grass. For the first time in weeks, I wasn't searching for answers. The biggest questions had already been answered. The truth was out. The lies were exposed. The records had done their job. So why did I feel unfinished? The answer sat beside me on the passenger seat. The black ledger. Grandpa's ledger. 22 years of evidence. 22 years of patience. 22 years of protection. And yet something still bothered me. The ledger explained what happened. It explained why. But it didn't explain one thing. Grandpa himself. Not completely. Because people don't spend decades documenting a story unless they hope for something at the end of it. What had he hoped for? I parked beside the workshop. The gravel crunched beneath my shoes. A warm breeze drifted across the property. The red building stood exactly as it always had. Steady. Reliable. Unchanged. Just like Grandpa had been. Inside, sunlight streamed through dusty windows. The familiar smell of sawdust greeted me. For a moment, I simply stood there. Listening. Remembering. The old clock near the workbench still ticked softly. Grandpa had repaired it years ago. Of course he had. He repaired everything. Or at least he tried to. I placed the ledger on the workbench. The same bench where I had first opened it. The same bench where this final chapter began. Then I noticed something. A folded piece of paper tucked inside the back cover. I froze. I had read the ledger dozens of times. How had I missed it? Carefully, I pulled it free. One sheet. Handwritten. My name at the top. Nothing else. Just Daniel. My chest tightened immediately. Because unlike the other notes, this one wasn't evidence. This one was personal. I unfolded it and began reading. Daniel, if you're reading this, then the ledger worked. That means the truth survived. Good. Now let me tell you something important. I did not spend 22 years collecting records because of money. Money is useful. Money is necessary, but money was never the point. The point was memory. People forget. Then they simplify. Then they rewrite. Eventually, they convince themselves the new story is the real one. I wanted at least one person to know what actually happened. Not because I wanted anyone punished. Because reality matters. You matter. I stopped reading. My vision blurred. I blinked hard. Then continued. You will be tempted to measure your life against Ethan's. Don't. That was never the lesson. Your worth was never reduced because someone else received more. Their mistake was believing support should be earned by personality instead of character. They confused confidence with value. Many people do. Don't make the same mistake. I swallowed hard. The workshop seemed very quiet. Outside, wind rustled through the trees. For a moment, it felt almost like Grandpa was sitting nearby. Talking, explaining, teaching, just like always. The final section hit hardest. If the truth comes out, forgive when you're ready. Not because they deserve it. Because carrying anger for decades is exhausting. Trust me on that one. And if Ethan truly didn't know, don't lose your brother over mistakes he didn't make. Family is hard enough to rebuild when both people are trying. Impossible when only one is. One more thing. Open the bottom drawer of my workbench. You'll know which one. Love, Grandpa. I lowered the letter slowly. For several seconds, I couldn't move. Then I looked toward the workbench. Bottom drawer. A small laugh escaped me. Of course. Even now he wasn't finished. I walked over. Pulled the drawer open. Inside sat a small wooden box. Simple. Handmade. The kind Grandpa built for fun. The brass key. The one he gave me years earlier. The one I had carried in my glove compartment all this time. Suddenly, I knew exactly what it opened. My hands trembled slightly as I unlocked the box. Inside sat 2 envelopes. One labeled Daniel. The other labeled Ethan. And beneath them rested a photograph. I picked it up. The picture showed Grandpa and Grandma standing together. Young. Smiling. Happy. Written across the back were 6 words. Take care of each other. That was it. Not a financial instruction. Not a legal document. Not another revelation. Just 6 words. Simple words. Important words. The kind Grandpa valued most. I opened my envelope. Inside was a check. Significant. More than I expected. Enough to change things. Enough to help. Enough to matter. But not enough to explain 22 years of effort. Because that was never the point. The second envelope remained sealed. Ethan's. I stared at it for several seconds, then slipped it into my jacket pocket. A week later, I drove to the lake house. The same dock. The same water. The same place where I finally realized Ethan wasn't my enemy. He was sitting near the shoreline when I arrived. Quiet. Thoughtful. Older somehow. The past few weeks had aged all of us. I handed him the envelope. What's this? Grandpa. He stared at it, then opened it. The silence lasted a long time. When he finally looked up, his eyes were wet. Neither of us mentioned the check. Neither of us mentioned the money. Because neither of us needed to. Instead, I handed him the photograph. He turned it over. Read the words. Then laughed softly. A sad laugh. A grateful one. Sounds like him. Yeah. For several minutes, we sat quietly beside the water. No arguments. No accusations. No speeches. Just 2 brothers. Trying to understand the same history. Trying to build something better than it. That was enough. At least for now. Months later, things remained complicated with my parents. Healing wasn't instant. Trust doesn't return overnight. Sometimes it doesn't return at all. But something important changed. The lies stopped. The excuses stopped. Reality finally had a seat at the table. And that made every future conversation more honest. More real. More possible. The ledger now sits on a shelf in my office. Not hidden. Not locked away. Visible. Exactly where Grandpa would have wanted it. Occasionally, I take it down. Not to reread the evidence. Not to revisit old wounds. Just to remember one simple truth. People can rewrite stories. They can reshape memories. They can even convince themselves those new versions are real. But truth is patient. Truth waits. And sometimes, if someone cares enough to protect it, truth survives long enough to find the person who needs it most. For 22 years, Grandpa protected that truth. In the end, the inheritance wasn't his greatest gift. The truth was. And unlike money, nobody could ever take that away.